The night had fallen heavy and wet, with raindrops hitting the pavement like sharp needles. A cold wind whipped through the streets, making the city feel even colder than it already was. Cars rushed by, their tires splashing the puddles, while pedestrians hurried to find shelter from the storm. Among the hustle and bustle, one figure stood out in the night, a woman drenched and shivering, sitting on the cold concrete sidewalk. She was huddled close to a small cardboard box, the only thing protecting her from the elements. Her clothes were worn, threadbare, and her shoes were nothing more than soaked rags. Wrapped in a thin blanket, she held a baby against her chest, its tiny face red from the chill. Her eyes, tired and empty, were fixed on the ground, hoping for a kind soul to notice her. But no one did. The world rushed around her, too busy to even glance at the woman and her baby. People passed by, avoiding her gaze, wrapped up in their own lives. It wasn't unusual. Homelessness was something people preferred not to see. But today, as the woman reached her hand out, asking for help, something unusual happened. From across the street, a sleek black car slowed to a stop at the red light. Inside, a man sat behind the wheel, his hands resting on the steering wheel. His name was Thomas Pierce, and he was the picture of wealth and success. He had built his empire from the ground up, a self-made millionaire with everything anyone could wish for, except happiness. His tailored suit, designer watch, and polished shoes reflected a life of luxury. Yet, for all the money in the world, there was still a hollowness in his eyes, a void that he'd been trying to fill for years with more and more success. As the light turned green, Thomas moved his foot to the gas pedal, but something made him pause. His eyes flicked to the woman on the sidewalk, her desperate face barely visible in the dim streetlight. He watched her for a moment, an unfamiliar tug pulling at his heart. The baby in her arms seemed so fragile, so vulnerable against the harsh world. Without thinking, Thomas's hand reached for the glove compartment and grabbed the thick wad of cash he always kept there. His mind raced, torn between helping or turning away. The rain began to fall harder, a torrent of water that soaked through his car window. The woman's small form huddled further into herself, her shivering body a silent plea for mercy. He had to do something. He couldn't just drive away like everyone else. His grip tightened on the cash, and before he could second-guess himself, he threw open the door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a slap, but it didn't matter. With each step, his shoes splashed through the puddles, his suit getting drenched. The thought of his own comfort didn't seem so important now. As he reached the woman, she didn't look up. She hadn't noticed him approach, too exhausted from the battle of survival to even lift her head. Standing above her, Thomas hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want to help. It was that he didn't know what to say. What could he offer her? She was a stranger to him, just another face in the crowd of a city that didn't care. Yet something about the way she held her baby, so tender, so protective, tugged at something deep within him. He crouched down beside her, careful not to startle her. The woman flinched, looking up at him through her wet hair, her face exhausted and weary. I don't want any trouble, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just trying to survive. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. The words that had been forming in his mind felt so inadequate now. Here he was, a millionaire with more money than he could ever spend, and this woman had nothing but her baby in a cardboard box. He knew what most people would do, throw her some cash maybe, and walk away feeling good about themselves. But he couldn't do that. He couldn't just give her money and pretend everything was fine. The rain kept falling, pouring down in sheets, but it wasn't the rain that made his clothes cold. It was the weight of the situation, the guilt and the shame that gnawed at his insides. He had everything, yet he had never once truly cared about the world around him. Was this what it took to change? A simple moment of empathy? Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open. The woman's eyes widened when she saw the thick stack of bills in his hand. She opened her mouth to speak, but Thomas didn't wait for her to finish. Instead, he took out a large amount of cash and placed it gently into her hands. For a moment, the woman stared at the money, disbelief and confusion dancing across her face. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever done this for her before. She was used to people avoiding her, pretending she didn't exist. Then slowly she lifted her gaze to meet his eyes, her tear-streaked face softening for the first time since he'd arrived. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas hesitated for a moment, not sure how to explain the sudden shift in his heart. The answer was simple, though. He had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time, and that alone was enough to make him realize how little he had been living for. Thomas watched the woman carefully, her face a mix of confusion and gratitude. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped from the weight of life's relentless burdens. But it wasn't just that. There was something else, a quiet desperation that he couldn't ignore. He had to speak, but the words didn't come easily. How could he explain what had happened to him, this sudden shift in perspective? Why did it matter to him now? He wasn't the kind of man to act on impulse, let alone take a step back from his self-centered world to truly help a stranger. Yet here he was, drenched in the rain, standing in front of this woman who had nothing, and it felt like a slap in the face to everything he had built his life around. The woman's eyes flicked to the cash in her hands, still unsure of how to react. I don't know what to say," she stammered, clearly overwhelmed. "I didn't expect this. You don't even know me." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know, but I can see you. I see you more than I've seen anyone in a long time." The words hung in the air between them. The woman glanced down at her baby, her small hands tightening protectively around the child. Thomas could see the care and love in the way she held the baby, the only thing in the world she truly had left. His eyes softened, and he crouched down a little further, trying to make himself seem less imposing. "I'm sorry you're going through this," he said quietly. "I wish there was more I could do." She shook her head, almost as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "You're already doing something. No one ever stops. They just walk on by." Her voice cracked as she looked at the ground, fighting back tears. "I'm just trying to survive. I have nothing else to offer." Thomas's heart clenched in his chest. He had everything he could ever want: fame, money, power, and yet it all felt so hollow now. Here was a woman with almost nothing, and yet she had this profound strength in her eyes, a will to fight that he hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. It was almost like she was teaching him something about resilience, about the things that truly mattered in life. The rain continued to pour, but neither of them seemed to mind it anymore. Thomas stood up, taking a deep breath as if to ground himself in the moment. He was determined not to make her feel like she owed him anything. This wasn't about gratitude or repayment. This was about him doing something for once in his life that didn't come with an expectation of anything in return. He pulled out his phone, a thought sparking in his mind. "Do you have anywhere to go? A shelter or somewhere safe?" The woman shook her head. "I've been to all of them. They're full. Some of them don't even let people like me in." "Like you?" Thomas asked, the words barely escaping his lips before he realized the weight they carried. "People like me," she repeated, her voice hardening just a little. "The ones who've been on the streets for too long, the ones who aren't clean enough, the ones who don't look the right way. People like me don't get second chances." Thomas stood there for a moment, processing what she said. It was a bitter truth, one he knew all too well. He had grown up seeing the divide between the haves and the have-nots, but hearing it from someone like her, someone so raw, so broken, made it hit a lot harder than he expected. He didn't want to be another person who just walked away. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated as if she wasn't sure if she should tell him. Maybe she thought he would forget it, like everyone else. Maybe she was afraid he would walk away just like the rest. But something in her eyes shifted, and after a long pause, she spoke. "My name is Rachel," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel," he repeated, trying it out like it was the first time he had truly heard a name. "I'm Thomas. I want to help. I'll find a place for you to stay tonight." Somewhere safe. Rachel looked at him as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. You can't just find me a place. It's not that easy. I know, Thomas replied, his voice firm, but I'll try, and I'm not leaving until I know you're somewhere safe. For the first time since they had spoken, a small smile flickered across Rachel's face. It wasn't much, just a ghost of a smile, but it made something shift inside Thomas. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest seemed to lift just a little. I don't know what to say. You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me, Rachel said again, her eyes filled with wonder and skepticism. Thomas looked at her, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't fully articulate. He hadn't been this affected by anything in a long time, maybe ever. Maybe I don't know you, but I'm willing to get to know you. And right now, what I know is that you need help, and I can give that to you. He didn't know how this would play out. He didn't know if Rachel would trust him or if he could follow through on his promise. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something real, something that mattered. As the rain continued to pour down, Thomas extended his hand to her, the gesture simple but full of meaning. Let's get you out of here. Rachel looked at Thomas's outstretched hand, hesitation flashing in her eyes. She had spent so long surviving on her own, trusting no one, that it felt almost unnatural to accept help from a stranger. But there was something about the sincerity in his eyes, something in the way he stood there, drenched in the rain, as if he meant every word. She could tell he wasn't just offering her money or a quick fix. He was offering something deeper, something that seemed to come from a place she had long forgotten existed. Still, her instincts screamed to be cautious. The world had taught her not to trust easily, and kindness often came with strings attached. She glanced down at her baby, her heart aching with the burden of motherhood. It was one thing to look after herself, but now, with her child in her arms, she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She needed to be sure, but the cold, the wet, and the hopelessness of the streets were suffocating her, and she couldn't keep pretending that she could handle it alone anymore. Slowly, Rachel took a breath and reached out, placing her hand in his. Thomas's grip was warm despite the rain, and for a moment, the storm outside felt distant. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew she had to take a chance. For her baby's sake, if nothing else. He helped her to her feet, his hand gentle but firm as he guided her to the car. The moment she stepped inside, the warmth of the leather seats wrapped around her like a blanket, a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside. She shivered, suddenly aware of how long she had been out in the storm, how her body had been running on nothing but desperation. Thomas started the engine, the car humming to life as he pulled away from the curb. The city lights blurred in the rearview mirror as they left the streets behind. The quiet inside the car felt almost surreal after the chaos outside, and Rachel couldn't help but glance at Thomas, wondering about the man beside her. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "I know a place," he said, his voice steady. "It's not a shelter, but it's safe. It's just a short drive." Rachel nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of relief wash over her. She still didn't know who this man was or why he had chosen to help her, but she didn't want to question it too much. She was too exhausted, too cold, and too desperate to care. She had to trust him, at least for now. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows as Thomas drove through familiar streets. Rachel staring out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind. How had she ended up here? How had everything gone so wrong? She had once had a family, a home, a life that felt whole. But one mistake, one bad decision after another, had spiraled her life out of control. Her husband had left her, and with no family to turn to, she'd found herself on the streets, trying to survive with her baby. She had learned to keep her head down, avoid trouble, and do whatever it took to keep them both alive. But tonight something had shifted. She had stepped out of the cold, out of the street corner where she had begged for spare change, and into the warmth of a stranger's car. She hadn't seen this coming, not in a million years. "Thank you," she said quietly, breaking the silence again. I don't know how to. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Thomas replied, his eyes on the road. "You don't owe me anything. This is just the right thing to do." Rachel didn't know why those words hit her so hard, but they did. She had heard a lot of things in her life, mostly pity, judgment, and cold indifference. But those words, those simple words, felt like a lifeline. She wasn't used to kindness without an agenda. As they turned onto a quieter street, Thomas pulled up to a modest, unassuming building. It wasn't much, just a small apartment complex tucked away on a side street. But it felt like a world apart from the chaos of the streets Rachel had known for so long. "This is where I live," Thomas said as he parked the car. "It's not fancy, but it's safe. I'll take you inside, get you dry clothes, and make sure you're comfortable for the night." Rachel hesitated for a moment, her hands still clutching her baby. The weight of the situation hit her all at once. She had never accepted help from anyone before. She had always kept her distance, kept her walls up, and now she was walking into a stranger's home. But the exhaustion in her bones, the coldness in her heart, told her she couldn't refuse. She needed to rest, needed to breathe for the first time in ages. So she followed Thomas out of the car, clutching her baby close to her chest as they entered the building. The hallway inside was quiet, the air still warm despite the rain pounding outside. Thomas led her upstairs to a small apartment, the kind of place that looked lived in, but not extravagant. The scent of coffee and something homemade filled the air, a comforting reminder of what it felt like to be taken care of. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she had felt that way, cared for, looked after. He opened the door and she stepped inside, blinking in surprise at how cozy the apartment was. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it felt safe. There was a small couch against one wall, a simple kitchen area, and a bed in the corner. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, but she could still hear the rain tapping against the glass. "I'll grab you a towel and some dry clothes," Thomas said, disappearing into another room. Rachel stood in the middle of the room, still in disbelief. She looked down at her baby, who had finally stopped crying, his tiny face pressed against her chest. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. Thomas returned a few minutes later, carrying a fluffy towel and a set of warm, dry clothes. He placed them on the couch and motioned for Rachel to sit. She hesitated for a moment, still unsure if this was all real. Her mind was racing, wondering if she was making the right choice, but her body had already decided. The exhaustion had taken over, and the warmth in the room felt like a soft embrace she hadn't known in years. "Go ahead," Thomas said, his tone gentle but insistent. "I'll give you a few minutes to get settled." Rachel nodded, carefully placing her baby in a small bassinet near the couch. Her baby, wrapped in the thin blanket she had been clutching, was already asleep, his little body exhausted from the ordeal of the night. She took a deep breath before standing up, feeling the weight of the day catch up with her. She had been through so much just to get here, and yet in this quiet room, it felt like she could finally breathe. She walked into the small bathroom off the side of the apartment, shutting the door behind her. The warmth from the towel was immediate, and as she wiped the rain from her face, she found herself letting out a shaky sigh, the tension that had gripped her all evening slowly beginning to melt away. She had never allowed herself to feel this kind of relief before, not like this. When she emerged a few minutes later, wrapped in the dry clothes Thomas had given her, she felt like a completely different person. The simple act of putting on fresh clothes felt like a rebirth. She wasn't the woman who had been begging in the streets anymore. She wasn't the desperate mother trying to protect her child from the cold and the cruelty of the world. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt human again. Thomas was sitting on the couch, flipping through a stack of papers, but he looked up when she came into the room. "How do you feel?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for an answer. Rachel smiled, a small, tentative thing. "Better. A lot better. Thank you." Thomas nodded but didn't say anything right away. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he finally spoke again. "I know this might feel strange, but "Do you mind if I ask how you ended up on the streets? I mean, I can see you're trying to protect your baby, but—" Rachel's heart dropped into her stomach. She had known this moment was coming, the part where she would have to tell someone the truth. But the truth felt so heavy, like a weight that had been slowly crushing her for years. She wasn't sure she was ready to share it all with him. She didn't know if she could. She sat down on the couch, her eyes drifting to the bassinet where her baby slept soundly. "It's a long story," she said, her voice quiet. I guess it started with my ex-husband. He left me when I was pregnant. He said he couldn't handle it. Being a father, being married to someone like me. We were poor, and I wasn't enough for him." Thomas stayed silent, listening. She could feel his eyes on her, but it wasn't judgment she felt. There was something in his gaze, something that made her feel like he truly understood, even if he didn't know the details of her life. "I tried to make it work. I really did. I thought that if I just worked harder, found a better job, I could turn things around. But the bills piled up, the eviction notices kept coming, and eventually, we were on the streets, me and my baby. I couldn't even provide for him the way I wanted to." Her voice caught in her throat, and for the first time in a long while, the tears that had been buried deep inside her started to surface. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the sudden wave of emotion. But Thomas didn't flinch. He simply reached over, gently placing a hand on hers. "You've been through more than most people could handle," he said softly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not by someone who was supposed to love you." Rachel didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected him to say something so kind, so understanding. It was strange hearing someone speak to her like she was more than just a homeless woman, more than just a mother struggling to survive. It was as if he saw her for who she was, not just her circumstances. "I've been so scared," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Scared that I would never get out of this, that my son would grow up in this environment. I want so much more for him, but I don't know how to get there. I don't know if I can." Thomas's hand tightened around hers, offering her the reassurance she didn't know she needed. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice full of resolve. "You don't have to keep fighting this battle on your own. There are ways out. I'll help you find them. You don't have to give up." Rachel looked up at him, feeling something shift inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe she didn't have to settle for a life of struggle and survival. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to rebuild, a chance to start again. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Thomas replied. "You've already said everything I need to hear." The silence between them wasn't awkward, but rather comforting. The tension that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Thomas had done more for her in one night than anyone had in years, and somehow she knew that this wouldn't be the last time he helped her. The apartment grew quiet as Thomas and Rachel sat together, the warmth of the room wrapping around them like a cocoon. Outside, the storm had begun to die down, the heavy rain turning into a gentle drizzle. The air inside felt heavy with unspoken words, but somehow it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like they were both in the middle of something significant, something that would change both their lives. Rachel's baby stirred in the bassinet, stretching slightly, and Rachel immediately stood up to check on him. Her heart swelled at the sight of his small, peaceful face, so innocent against the stormy backdrop of the world outside. Her son, her only source of joy in the darkest of times. She reached down and gently stroked his cheek, a soft smile appearing on her face. In that moment, all the struggles, all the pain she had endured seemed distant. There was just her son and the hope she held for his future. Thomas watched her from the couch, his gaze softening as he observed her tenderness. He could see the raw love she had for her child, how she would do anything to make sure he was safe and loved. It reminded him of his own struggles, his own broken family, the feelings of abandonment and loneliness that had shaped his own life. In a way, Rachel's story resonated with him more than he expected. After a few moments, Rachel sat back down next to him, still keeping an eye on her baby. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but comforting. It was as if they had both found a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos of their lives. "Thank you again," Rachel said softly, breaking the quiet. "I don't know how to repay you for all of this." "You don't have to repay me," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, because I want to help you." Rachel looked at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She had spent so long fighting on her own, constantly looking over her shoulder, never able to trust anyone. And here she was, sitting in this stranger's apartment, receiving kindness without any strings attached. It was surreal, almost too good to be true. I never thought someone like you would even notice me," Rachel admitted, her voice small. "I've been invisible to most people for so long. I've been so used to the judgment, the rejection. I didn't know anyone like you would care." Thomas shifted in his seat, his eyes thoughtful. "Why wouldn't I care? Everyone deserves help. Everyone deserves a chance. You're not invisible to me, Rachel. You're a mother trying to protect your child. That's all that matters." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She wasn't used to hearing things like that. She wasn't used to being seen for who she truly was. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable, but in a way it also felt like a weight had been lifted. She had spent so many years hiding behind the walls she had built, afraid of being hurt, of being judged. And now, in front of Thomas, she felt seen, truly seen. "I want to help you more," Thomas said, breaking the silence once again. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing. If you want, I can help you get back on your feet. I can connect you with resources, get you in touch with people who can provide a more permanent solution. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm here for you." Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't what she had expected at all. She had thought that maybe he would help her for a night, give her a few $100s, and send her on her way. But this was different. This was a promise, a real promise to help her rebuild her life. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't even know me. I'm just some woman on the streets. I don't even have anything to offer you." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I don't need anything from you. I'm doing this because I can, and because it's the right thing to do. No one deserves to be left behind, Rachel, and no one deserves to feel like they're invisible." Rachel's heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She had always felt like she was fighting a battle she couldn't win, and now here was this man offering her a chance, offering her hope. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But at the same time, a part of her was afraid. Afraid that it was all too good to be true, that this moment would slip away like everything else in her life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how to accept this. I've never been given this kind of opportunity before." "You don't have to accept it right away," Thomas said gently. "Take your time, think about it. But know that I'm here, and I'll help however I can." Rachel nodded, her chest tight with emotion. She didn't know where this would lead, or if she could ever truly accept help without feeling like she was imposing on someone's kindness. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of that help, and that in itself was a small victory. Thomas glanced at the clock on the wall, then looked back at Rachel. "You should get some rest. I'll help you figure things out tomorrow. We can start making a plan. For now, just relax. You've been through a lot." Rachel agreed, and after one last look at her sleeping baby, she stood up. "Where can I sleep?" "There's a spare room down the hall," Thomas replied. "I'll get you settled in there." Rachel followed him down the hallway, her mind still processing everything that had happened in the past few hours. It felt like a dream, like a life she hadn't thought possible. As she lay down on the bed, pulling the blankets around her. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a small but growing flame that had been extinguished for far too long. As she closed her eyes, she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not just for tonight, but for the possibility of a future that seemed so far out of reach only hours before. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams of warmth across the room. Rachel stirred in the bed, the soft sounds of the city waking up around her. For a moment, she forgot where she was, caught between the comfort of the bed and the lingering feeling of disbelief from the night before. But then the reality of her situation slowly came back to her, and her heart tightened. She wasn't on the streets anymore. She wasn't fighting to survive. For the first time in so long, she had a bed to sleep in, a roof over her head, and someone who cared enough to help. She didn't know how long this would last, or if she could even trust this new reality, but for now it felt like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. The baby stirred in the bassinet next to the bed, his small hands reaching up in a search for comfort. Rachel immediately rolled over and picked him up, cradling him in her arms. His warm, tiny body settled against hers, and she breathed in his sweet, innocent scent. Her son was the only constant in her life, the only thing she could always count on. She gently rocked him in her arms, her mind still trying to process the events of the previous night, the kindness Thomas had shown her, the way he hadn't treated her like an outcast or a problem to solve. It was something she hadn't experienced in years. It felt so foreign, yet so necessary. It was the first real act of kindness she had witnessed in so long, and it made her wonder if there was more to life than the struggle for survival. Rachel heard footsteps outside the door, followed by a gentle knock. "Morning," Thomas's voice called softly from the other side. "I made coffee, and I thought you might want to join me when you're ready." The simple invitation felt warm, like a gesture that had no hidden agenda. Rachel swallowed hard, wiping away the tears that threatened to fall. She wasn't used to this. No one had ever treated her like this before. She wasn't used to being welcomed, to being seen as someone worthy of care and consideration. "I'll be right out," she called, trying to steady her voice. "Thank you." A soft chuckle came from the other side of the door. "No need to thank me. Just take your time." Rachel sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, taking a deep breath. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this was a moment to embrace. She couldn't let fear rule her anymore. She had to take that first step toward a better future for herself and her son. After a few minutes, she stood, gently placing her baby back in the bassinet. She grabbed the clothes Thomas had given her the night before and quickly changed into them. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked different, stronger. For the first time, she saw someone who could rebuild her life, someone who deserved a second chance. When she walked into the living room, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Thomas was sitting at the small dining table, a mug in his hands. The apartment, though modest, felt like a safe haven, a place where Rachel could finally let her guard down. Thomas looked up and smiled as she entered, his expression warm. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in a long time," Rachel said, offering him a small smile in return. "Thank you again for everything." "No need to keep thanking me," Thomas said with a shrug, though his eyes softened. "You're welcome. I meant it when I said I wanted to help. If there's anything I can do today, just let me know." Rachel took a seat at the table across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the mug of coffee he had poured for her. She could feel the weight of her emotions rising again, but she forced herself to focus on the present, on the simple act of sharing a cup of coffee with someone who actually cared. "Have you had breakfast yet?" Thomas asked as he set his mug down. "No, I haven't. She stopped herself, unsure how to finish. She hadn't had a real meal in days, let alone something that wasn't eaten on the go or out of a can. "I can make something if you're hungry," Thomas offered. "Nothing fancy, just some eggs and toast, but it's better than nothing." Rachel nodded gratefully. "That sounds perfect." As Thomas got up to start preparing breakfast, Rachel watched him quietly. He moved through the kitchen with ease, a kind of calm confidence in everything he did. She couldn't help but wonder about him. He seemed so different from anyone she had known before, someone who didn't just offer help because it was convenient, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. But then a thought crossed her mind. Why was he doing this? It wasn't like Thomas had any reason to help her. He didn't know her. He had no obligation to care for a homeless woman with a baby. She knew that people like him, wealthy, successful, and independent, didn't often reach out to those in need unless there was some gain for them. So why was he doing this? She wanted to ask him, but she was afraid of the answer. Maybe he had an agenda, something she couldn't see, or maybe he was just doing this out of some misplaced sense of guilt or charity. She didn't know, but for the moment, she decided to put that thought aside. She couldn't afford to question his kindness, not when it was the only thing that had given her a glimmer of hope in so long. "Here you go," Thomas said, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Nothing fancy, but I hope it helps." Rachel smiled and took a bite, the warmth of the food filling her in a way she hadn't experienced in months. It was simple, but it was the first real meal she'd had in so long, and it felt like a small victory. As they ate in silence, Rachel felt a quiet sense of gratitude settle in her chest. Whatever Thomas's reasons for helping her, she wasn't going to question it. She wasn't going to waste this opportunity. She was going to take it, hold on to it, and use it to build a future where she could finally give her son the life he deserved. As Rachel finished her breakfast, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The weight of the world hadn't lifted completely, but for the first time it felt manageable. The storm outside had passed, and even though the city continued its hectic pace, there was a calm in this small apartment, a space where she could breathe without fear of what might come next. Thomas sat across from her, his eyes warm but thoughtful, as if he were trying to gauge how she was doing. She had a million questions in her mind, questions that she was afraid to ask, afraid to burden him with. But for now, the only thing that mattered was her son and how she was going to give him a life better than the one she had endured. "After breakfast, we can talk about what's next," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "I know you probably have a lot on your mind. I just want you to know you're not alone in this anymore. We'll figure something out together." Rachel nodded, her heart swelling at his words. It was still hard for her to believe. People like Thomas didn't just offer help like this. They didn't open their doors to strangers, especially not those who had nothing to offer in return. There had to be more to this. But for now, she would take it. She would take the kindness, the chance to rebuild, and hold on to the hope that it was real. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice soft. "Everything feels so overwhelming. I've been living in survival mode for so long, I don't even know what it means to have a real plan anymore." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes steady. "That's okay. We can take it one step at a time. I think the first thing is making sure you and your son are taken care of. Shelter, food, medical care if needed. Then we can talk about longer-term plans, getting you some job opportunities, finding more stability. But it starts with small steps." Rachel couldn't help but feel a tiny glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about a future beyond the struggle. It felt almost impossible to imagine, but Thomas was offering her a way out. He was offering her a hand when so many others had turned their backs. "How do I even begin?" she asked quietly, staring down at the empty plate in front of her. "How do I go from where I was to something better?" "You don't have to do it all at once," Thomas said reassuringly. "It's a process, Rachel, but we can start with what you need right now. You've got your son, and that's the most important thing. Everything else will come in time. But first, I want to help you get connected with some resources that can offer immediate assistance. Places that can help with food, healthcare, housing." Rachel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was a chance to change everything. For herself, for her son. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "No one's ever treated me like this before. No one's ever cared enough to help." Thomas looked at her, his gaze soft and unwavering. "You don't have to repay me. It's not about that. It's about helping you get back on your feet. No one deserves to be stuck in the situation you're in. You're a mother, and you're doing the best you can for your child. That's all that matters." Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. These weren't tears of hopelessness or defeat. They were tears of relief, of someone finally seeing her for who she was and not just her circumstances. For the first time in so long, she felt seen. She felt like she mattered. She wiped her eyes, trying to regain composure. But the flood of emotions she had been holding back for so long was finally finding its way to the surface. It was as if she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and now it was being shared by someone else. A stranger, yes, but someone who cared enough to take action. "I'll do whatever it takes," Rachel said, her voice a little more steady now. "For my son. I'll do whatever it takes to give him a better life." "That's all anyone can ask for," Thomas replied, standing up from the table. "Now let's make sure you have the support you need. It won't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. And I'll be here to help you along the way." Rachel nodded, her heart swelling with both fear and hope. She had been through so much, but she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't invisible, and she wasn't fighting alone. The next few hours passed quickly. Thomas helped her make phone calls to social services, setting up appointments to get her the help she needed. They discussed her next steps, the logistics of finding a job, finding housing, and starting over. Thomas was patient, offering guidance without pushing, letting Rachel take the lead on the decisions, but always offering his support. At one point, Rachel excused herself to check on her baby. She was overwhelmed by the amount of change happening in such a short time. It felt like everything was falling into place, but it also felt terrifying. What if it didn't work out? What if she couldn't keep up with the promise of a better future? As she held her son close, rocking him gently in her arms, she whispered to him, "We'll be okay, I promise. We'll be okay." The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and new beginnings. With Thomas's help, Rachel navigated through the maze of social services, filling out forms, scheduling appointments, and finding resources she never knew existed. For the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a path forward, albeit a difficult one, but a path nonetheless. The first step was finding a temporary shelter for her and her baby, a safe place where they could stay, while Rachel worked on finding more permanent housing. It wasn't ideal, but it was a roof over their heads, and for now, that was enough. The nights at the shelter were hard, but Rachel held on to the small victories. She had a warm place to sleep, and her baby had his needs met. It was more than she had hoped for just a week ago. Thomas continued to be a constant source of support, checking in with her daily, making sure she had everything she needed. He introduced her to a woman who worked at a local nonprofit, someone who could help her with job applications and interview preparation. Rachel, once too afraid to even dream of a stable job, began to see the possibility of securing work. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it would be enough to start. One evening, after a long day of appointments and errands, Rachel sat down on the couch in her temporary shelter, her baby asleep in her arms. She gazed out the window, watching the city bustle in the distance. The world outside seemed so indifferent, so relentless, but inside her heart, there was a new kind of peace settling in. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up, slightly startled, but when she saw Thomas standing in the doorway, a smile tugged at her lips. He had been her lifeline these past few days, a steady hand guiding her through the uncertainty. It felt surreal to her, as if this was all happening to someone else, but the reality of it was undeniable. She was rebuilding her life, step by step, with his help. "Hey," Thomas said, walking into the small room. He set a bag of groceries on the table and pulled a chair to sit across from her. "How's it going?" Rachel smiled, though it was tired. "It's going. Not easy, but I'm making it. We're making it." He nodded, his expression warm but thoughtful. "I know it's not where you want to be, but you're doing it. You're taking it day by day. And that's what matters." She looked down at her baby, who was now peacefully asleep, a small smile on his face. "I never thought I could get here," she said quietly. "I never thought I could trust someone again. But you've been more than I could have asked for." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "You've been strong all along, Rachel. You just needed someone to remind you of that. No one can do it alone. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had always carried the weight of the world alone, believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now she realized that strength wasn't about doing it all on your own. It was about finding the courage to reach out, to trust, and to accept the help when it was offered. Thomas's smile was gentle. "You're going to do great, and whenever you need help, no matter what, I'm here. I'll always be here." Rachel's heart swelled with gratitude, but she knew it was time for her to stand on her own 2 feet. She wasn't the same person who had stepped into his car in the rain, desperate and broken. She was a mother, a woman rebuilding her life, and she had the strength to keep going. "I'll never forget what you've done for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to say thank you for everything, but I will never forget." "You don't need to thank me," Thomas said, his tone sincere. "You've got this, Rachel. You've always had this. I just gave you a little push. The rest is all you." Rachel wiped away the tears that had welled up in her eyes, feeling both a sense of relief and a quiet sadness. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, she was starting to believe that it would be something better than the life she had left behind. That night, as she lay in bed, cradling her baby in her arms, she whispered to him, "We're going to be okay, little one. I promise you that." And though she still didn't have all the answers, for the first time, Rachel believed her promise. She was ready to face the future, not with fear, but with hope.